Hello and welcome to Unparliamentary Language, a podcast that would never badmouth its ex-boss. How are you, Rob?
I'm very well, thank you. How are you?
Yeah, dealing a bit with the heat that we're currently having. I think I saw that it's the third or fourth hottest day on record this year. Like we've started a heat wave and it's just continuing. But I see some grey clouds, so maybe it's going to cool down in the next few days.
It's just muggy. It's cloudy here and it's just a mug fest, to be honest.
Slightly different tonight. We've had a bit, not a hiatus as such, but we've missed a few weeks because I've been very busy in real life. So we're going into two main stories tonight. So our first story, there's some headlines associated with that. Labour in turmoil from The Guardian, and the day Boris blew Labour up from the Mail.
Yeah, this was the big news that we sort of left on a cliffhanger in our last episode, that elections were round the corner, and boy, were there a lot of them. So we're going to try and cover all of them and their ramifications, if I can. Starting with the one that hit the headlines the most, and you may have seen pictures of a big inflatable Boris, which was as horrifying as it was eye-catching, in the constituency of Hartlepool, where the first by-election happened since the 2019 general election. So
what happened in Hartlepool? Why was there a giant floating Boris?
It was seen as one of the major tests for the government after the 2019 Conservative landslide victory. People were sort of, and another reason why it was so important to both parties was that Hartlepool is one of those seats that is traditionally part of the red wall that the media likes to talk about. So seats that have been traditionally Labour for up to 50 years. I think Hartlepool had returned a Labour MP since 1974. So if Labour were to lose this one, it certainly would look bad for them or represent quite a seismic shift. And if the Conservatives would win, it would show that they were still making those inroads into those sort of constituencies after that 2009. It would suggest that 2019 wasn't their high point for those red wall seats. There was some nervousness on both sides. I guess the nervousness for the Conservatives was that their polling numbers, as we've looked at in our previous episode, had gone down, and there was a point sort of like late last year where there wasn't a vaccine yet and they'd been suffering sort of like scandal after scandal after scandal. Their opinion rating was fairly low and Labour were just beating them in the polls. However, it's kind of gone the other way since the vaccine rollout, and we've seen the Conservatives have an upturn in fortunes. But of course, when you go to a local level, you never quite know what's going to happen. So the result was a big win for the Conservatives, with 15,529 votes, a swing of 23% towards them, and the candidate Jill Mortimer won 51.9% of the vote. So winning over 50% in any sort of first past the post system, particularly when you've got so many candidates standing. There were 16 parties that were represented in the Hartlepool by-election. So to get over 50% of votes and not have everybody split off is quite a remarkable achievement for the Conservatives, even more so when you consider it's a seat that they haven't won since 1974. So that is why you were seeing those terrible headlines for Labour and people trying to work out why it happened and what it all meant in the grander scheme of things, I guess.
I think there's a few things I want to point out here, though, because I think it's been very easy for people to take one particular number from this and focus on it. And I saw some people go, so like you just said, it's a 23% swing. People see that and they go, oh, that's a really big swing towards Conservatives. Mm. The thing I've raised that I want to point out here is that Reform UK, previously the Brexit Party, lost 24.6% in this area from the previous election. So if you look at 2019, Labour won by about 4,000 votes, just under. And there were 10,600 Brexit Party voters. Now, one thing we've discussed a bit before is that people from the Brexit Party tend to be slightly more conservative if they go away from the Brexit Party again. But what I think we've been seeing a lot more in the last few years is that when people swing away from the Brexit Party, they now go almost exclusively to the Conservatives. So actually, if you look at the result from 2019, and you just take 80% of those Brexit Party votes and put them onto the Conservatives, they win with a clear majority. So I don't think it's actually as surprising as some people made out based on those numbers. I think it would have been different, when Labour was more on the fence about Brexit and people could swing between the two. But I think it's now clear that most Brexit Party voters are swinging to Conservatives. However, having said that, there was a lower turnout and Labour's turnout was less. So Labour last time had 15,000 votes and this time only had 8,000. But if they'd had the same votes as they had in 2019, they'd have been 100 votes shy of the Conservatives. So I think that's a problem as well. I mean, there may be that some of those Labour voters have gone to Conservative, but it's also the drop of 15% in turnout seems to be like Labour people not turning out. It is how I read those results.
Yes, and I think, well, one, it's a big worry for Labour that the amount of people they're able to turn out is like, what, roughly under just half that they got? If they got 15,000, they've only been able to turn out or get 8,500 votes. That's a significant loss in people that have gone away from Labour or decided not to turn out in those 2 years. That in itself raises question for Keir Starmer, doesn't it? That there's clearly something different there that was attracting the people to the party in 2019 and isn't now. Now, there's a lot of things you can talk about, like people not turning out because of coronavirus, maybe. It was more of a hassle to go and vote. Maybe Jeremy Corbyn not being there is an effect. Jeremy Corbyn was much maligned by those like Keir Starmer and on the right of the party, but he was able to turn out a lot of people who were very passionate about Labour. And if you lose him at the top, maybe you lose some of that X factor amongst people that were deciding to come out. So that's a possible failure. And you talk about the drift from the Brexit party. Clearly, you've got 10,000 votes there. Clearly, they didn't all go to the Conservative Party. The Conservative only won, about 4,000 of that, if we're assuming that that's where the majority of the Conservative votes came from. But are those 6,000 that voted Brexit Party, are they gone out of party politics entirely? Were they only brought to the fore because Brexit was such a big issue at the time? It is quite an interesting... There's short-term effects and there's long-term effects. So people can go, look, in the short term, Brexit is over. People have moved away from the Brexit party to the Conservatives, and Boris Johnson has done a masterstroke by basically being the ultimate Brexiteer. He's been able to keep the Conservatives who really don't want Labour, but were maybe Remainers. He's kept them on side mostly. They're willing to vote Conservative still because he's the Conservative leader and they'll shut up and get on with it. But those who are really passionate about Brexit and voted for the Brexit Party or UKIP, they've come on side now. What a masterstroke. But it's not just Boris Johnson solving this problem in the short term. The Conservatives and Labour have had this Brexit problem for years and years and years now, going back to David Cameron when he won election back in 2015 against David Miliband. You forget that the UKIP was the third largest party in Great Britain in terms of number of percentage of people who voted for it, but they just didn't get a parliamentary seat. So this problem has been happening for both parties for about 6 years now. So maybe this delay in Labour losing these red wall seats has only really come about now that the Brexit question is sorted once and for all, and all of your Leave parties, your third Leave parties like the Brexit Party or UKIP or Reform, now the electorate seems disinterested in them. Now the question is off the table. That's where the votes are to be won, really. That was the big unrepresented electorate that has been there for the past 6 years. And we've talked about how Labour has kind of like made a mess of their Brexit party policy under Corbyn and arguably under Starmer now, but Starmer has to take responsibility for that legacy from Corbyn's one, given that he was the Brexit minister. They're kind of, we support Brexit, but we don't, clearly hasn't got through to those Labour voters who were in favour. And maybe those ones are the ones that are willing to go and vote Conservative just on those lines. Maybe the big question now is, can Boris keep them on side now that Brexit is definitely done? In the election in 2015, they'll want to see some return from Boris for their faith put in him. You know, we voted for you the first time. What are you going to do for us? They have to show that they're willing to repay that, because if they don't, then they might very quickly go back to Labour again.
The main thing I wanted to mention here is I think that as this result came out, we had a lot of people drawing immediate conclusions based off it. And I think they lacked the nuance of what you just put forwards, essentially. I think people were going, it's this massive swing. And I think that's why I wanted to just focus on the numbers a bit to show that it is more complex than it appears. There was already a trend away from Labour in 2019, where there's a swing of 5% away from them, for example. As we said, there was the Brexit Party vote that probably went majority Conservative or just didn't vote. And so, yes, it's bad, but it's not necessarily as bad as it first appears, and is kind of, if you actually look into the numbers, and we didn't really look into these numbers when we were predicting it either, I don't think it's that surprising that it happened if you look back at 2019. I think, obviously, hindsight is 2020, but I think if you look at it, you go, actually, we should have guessed based on this that it was going to be bad for them. Because you could have just added the Brexit Party votes onto the Conservative votes and clearly gone, that's a big lead. The only other thing I want to mention here is a bit of levity, is that the Monster Raving Loony Party's candidate in the 2021 Hartlepool by-election was the incredible Flying Brick, which is just amazing.
A couple of points just on what Keir Starmer did as a result of that election. I think it's worth pointing out that he did go to move Angela Rayner, who is the Labour Party deputy and a Corbyn ally. She was removed from her post as election organiser, and somebody else is going to fill that post. I can't remember who. And there was talk of a Labour reshuffle at the top as kind of crisis meetings. What are we going to do? How are we going to win these voters from Hartlepool back? But as we've kind of touched on, we don't think this is suddenly a reaction to Keir Starmer's leadership. It's more likely a long-term factor that's been happening since 2015, and Labour has been struggling to deal with that. That's, hey, they haven't won an election since 2005. They were having these issues for a long time, so it's not going to be solved overnight. But that did cause a bit of a ruckus in the party, given that Angela Rayner was so closely tied to the Corbynite wing of the government, and he can't reshuffle her as deputy leader because that is an elected position done by all Labour members. So he can't just remove her in that sense of the word. It kind of brought up some bad memories of when Corbynites were trying to remove Tom Watson from his deputy leadership post while Corbyn was in charge. It's those same old problems for Labour, that there seems to be these internal battles that they focus on when maybe they should be looking outwards into the electorate and seeing how they can appeal more to them rather than having these squabbles internally, I would say.
My one point I want to add there is I think as well, this is another thing where the knee-jerk reaction was everyone was like, oh, he's messed up his reshuffle, there's all of this, blah, 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 and people going on about that. And then the next day, Angela Rayner was in a different position. It's she's been moved around. He knows he can't get rid of her as deputy leader. Now, maybe there's some internal politicking going on and he doesn't like her, but it does seem she was interviewed and she was like, no, it wasn't as people were saying and stuff like that. And it was bad messaging maybe from the party, but, this is where we have the benefit of being able to look back on something a few weeks later. It seemed on that day everything, all of the Twitter discourse was as Twitter is, whereas now looking back on it, it's it wasn't really that big a deal, was it really? And it's more that I'd say probably the bigger deal is the fact that how things came out piecemeal was a really bad media strategy, more so than the fact that she got moved to a different position.
Yeah, totally. I'd agree with that. And just on the Boris thing, I think that, clearly Boris Johnson, the worry here is that he might overplay his hand slightly. Clearly Boris Johnson is a divisive figure, and you either love him or hate him. But this is more of a feeling than based on fact, so I'll preface that there. But I think Boris Johnson's handling of Corona and other things has not necessarily, and his various scandals that we talked about last time, hasn't necessarily showered him with, kind of affection from the British public. However, they seem to have faith that the Conservatives are, to quote an old phrase, a safe pair of hands to get people through this. We know what they're doing. They've got the vaccine out. We'll at least reward them for that. And there was a lot of talk about a vaccine bounce happening. So I think it might be more of a vaccine bounce rather than we still love Boris Johnson happening thing, because the British public have now had 2 years to judge his leadership, and we'll go into it more about what other people think of his leadership in our second main story. But there's certainly a lot of stories that don't cover Boris Johnson in the most amount of praise going on. So I would just temper that being maybe was a loss for Keir Starmer, and people were quick to put that on him, claiming that Labour had no policies and that Keir had to stand for something, and that was a reason Labour people didn't turn out. But I'm not quite sure that it was sort of Boris Johnson individually who made those people vote Conservative in Hartlepool. I think it was a grand number of factors involving Brexit and a vaccine that made people go that way. At least that's my opinion.
There were various interviews on the day. I think famously there was one on the BBC of some long-term Labour voters saying, oh, well, the Conservatives built us a load of food banks. And you do wonder if those particular people were particularly well informed about things. But people vote for all sorts of reasons. And it's also a criticism of our own coverage in the past. I think we have focused maybe sometimes on a few obvious issues. And you have to remember some people vote for all sorts of reasons that we can't work out. And those can all align in a way you don't expect and probably aren't covered by the polls. But I think what you've pointed out are probably the key thing. So moving on from that, so that was one big early piece of news, actually, because the result came out quite early on that and kind of tempered the discussion for the rest of the night. The other major things we had going on in England were local councils and then the mayors and crime commissioners. So let's split that. First, let's go with local councils. How were the local council results on the whole?
So I think you got it spot on when you said that the result coming in from Hartlepool kind of affected the whole discussion that we had around this going to be a great night, there's going to be a great day for the Conservatives and a bad one for Labour. And there was a lot of focus on those north wall, though that red wall kind of brick of constituencies up there to see what would happen in their council elections. When you look at the numbers as a whole, they do look good for the Conservatives and bad for Labour. So the Conservatives won 63 councils, so they're up by 13, whereas Labour won only 44 councils, and that's a change of -8. Conservatives also gained 235 councillors compared to Labour losing 327. So looking at those numbers kind of raw, you'd say, yeah, good night for the Conservatives, bad for Labour. But when you get a little closer look, particularly at those red wall councils, you can see that even though Labour lost control of Sheffield City and Durham Council, and the Conservatives gained control of Northumberland, there were also places where Labour did remarkably well, or at least had no losses. So Gateshead Council, Liverpool Council, Newcastle City Council, there were still 0 Conservatives elected there. And there are various councils across England with no sitting Conservatives in, which suggests that there are these very strong Labour heartlands still that are never going to switch Conservative. So at least Labour have got that tied up. The real worry for Labour, or where you might see, again, why people were criticising Starmer, and particularly, and maybe not just Starmer, but the Labour Party as a whole, saying what do they represent? You have a look down the ballot and you see that the Liberal Democrats were able to, basically steady the ship. They won 8 councillors. The Green Party, even though they don't have overall control of any councils, they gained 88 councillors in total and raised all of them up to 151, which I think is a remarkable result for them and might show
that's over double.
yeah. And I think shows a shift of particularly maybe those who are more like those who are on the left of the Labour Party are very strong for Corbyn. I think they're the ones who are most likely to have gone, I don't believe in Keir Starmer this time. This is probably going to be a Labour council already, but I feel that we could get some Green councillors in there to upset the balance and maybe force Labour to go into a coalition with the Greens. Therefore, we have more influence on these councils in the future. So that's the main story across England when you're looking at those council elections. Conservatives did do well. Labour lost out, but they weren't necessarily losing out to the Conservatives. Their biggest losses, I feel, or a significant chunk, came from people slipping away from Labour and either going back to the Liberal Democrats or to the Greens, and in greater numbers. And that clearly is where I think that's where Keir Starmer stands to gain the most in the short term. I think he could try and get those voters back from the Greens, from the Liberal Democrats, if he concentrated on it, because it seems that, like we've said, not that UKIP or Reform were big in councils anyway, because people tend to vote for them more in general elections or European. This election saw the last UKIP councillors wiped from the map. So they did have 48, they now have 0 after tonight, which kind of shows you that reshuffle, I think most of those UKIP councillors will now all go to the Conservatives instead. So you kind of got this balancing out of politics now. The Brexit question at least sorted, or is very much off the political table at the moment. It levelled out the landscape a bit, but certainly in the Conservatives' favour.
It's also interesting when you look at, I've linked there the Wikipedia page with the summary, and they have the estimated popular vote compared to 2019. So they're trying to compare as if this was a general election. And so the Conservatives did quite a bit better than they did in 2019. But the interesting thing is actually, despite all those losses in seats, actually Labour gained 1% of the popular vote. It's one of these things where, you can be doing well on the votes, but because of how the system is built up or how constituencies are divvied up, it can end up looking really bad on one metric and good on another. And I think this is very much a set of elections where a bit more scrutiny is good. That's partly the Conservatives wanted to pick it up as a big night of wins, but as you say, there's a lot going on. It's not just the Conservatives doing pretty well on council.
Yeah, certainly. Do you mind moving on to the next one, the Metro mayors?
Yeah, let's move straight on to the mayors. So there were quite a few mayors, including my mayor in London.
Oh yes. Oh well, we'll get to him at the end because that's interesting in its own right. But when you have a look at the Metro mayors, I think this is where the tide turns a little bit for Labour, and you certainly see a shift going on. So this was where the Conservatives managed to lose 2 of their mayors. There were 13 elections in England, and in the end, the Conservatives only won 2 of them. Now, you might expect them to go more for Labour anyway when you're dealing with areas like Greater Manchester and Liverpool, Labour strongholds. You'd expect those to go more towards Labour anyway, because that's where they've got their voters. But there were interesting losses, particularly in Cambridgeshire and Peterborough, and in the one that I voted on myself in the west of England. Those were former Conservatives mayors that went over to Labour for the first time. I think Labour benefited in these ones, particularly because of the voting system that is put in place for metro mayors, particularly where it's you get a second preference. So you count up, we talked about this, it's the same as what they've got in London. You count up all the votes for the first one. If nobody gets 50%, they then count the second preference votes and see what happens. And it's been long said by people, particularly on the left, that one of the problems is that, like, oh, we've got the Liberal Democrats on the left and they tend to split the vote. If you added Labour and the Lib Dems votes up, they'd beat the Conservatives every single time. And maybe these 2 results are kind of an indication that, yes, that certainly was a factor, that when people have a second preference, and if they never put Conservative as a second preference because they really don't want that person in, that's when those 2 parties on the left kind of can gang up on the Conservatives, particularly when I don't think parties like UKIP or Reform were even putting forward metro mayors because it's kind of not in their remit to do so. I can't remember having any literature through the door for one of those parties, but it was in our area, it was between 4: Labour, Liberal Democrats, Greens and Conservatives. So you've kind of got 3 left-wing parties there and only one right-wing. Well, if you vote Conservative as your first choice, are you likely to get a second choice for any of those others? And if you voted for any of the 3, are you likely to put Conservative as your second choice? Maybe not. So I think that's one where it particularly disadvantages the Conservatives. And I know that was one thing, although I don't know if it was actually put into the Queen's speech. They were looking to get rid of it, perhaps, the Conservatives, so they could benefit. They tend to benefit more from first past the post, so they might look at changing that in the future. But at the moment, I don't know if that went ahead.
I just want to add one thing on the end before we move on to London. I know we've talked a bit about Andy Burnham before. There's all the jokes about him being king in the north and things like that. It wouldn't surprise anyone, I'm sure, to find that all 10 districts in Manchester overwhelmingly voted for Labour and he stayed in. But he got a significant 67% of the vote there, won on the first round. And I think people have talked about him before because he did go against Corbyn for that leadership election within Labour back in the day. I think he is someone who has spent a lot of time being a mayor and building up strong support up north. And while Keir Starmer's not going anywhere right now, I definitely think he's someone to keep an eye on, because I think if he went for a leadership bid again, he could be someone who could move up the ranks within Labour. Although maybe he just wants to be mayor for a bit. I mean, he is mayor now. So, but I think it's just worth adding in that, like, he's doing very strong up in Manchester, and I would not be surprised if in a future Labour leadership contest he put his hat in the ring again.
I think you're absolutely right. I think that it was kind of the best thing for him, because before that I didn't really know him, and I would have just said, oh, he was a part of the metropolitan elite, as the Conservatives like to label the Labour Party at the moment. They kind of say that the Labour Party isn't for the working class anymore, it's for the middle class and all these metropolitan elites. Andy Burnham, by establishing himself as Manchester mayor and having quite a good... He can have the authority there, he can have the publicity bits. We talked about him during the corona...
He's been on the BBC newscast / coronavirus podcast, etc. Used to be Brexitcast multiple times throughout the pandemic, because there's been this tension between the Prime Minister and the local mayors, and he's kind of ended up being the spokesperson for that. I mean, I know they had the Liverpool mayor on as well and stuff like that, but in general, I'd say he's the one who has come out looking the best from all of that.
Yeah, this might be quite a blunt instrument to solve this problem, but if Labour's having trouble with those old red wall constituencies in the north, if you make your leader somebody who's from the north, who's represented that, those constituencies for years and years and has represented the Greater Manchester area, I think that might get through to those voters up there more than Keir Starmer, who they might perceive to be a London hoity-toity lawyer. That's the very basic politics there, but that's why I think people are marking him as a possible Labour leader, because he could be part of the solution to Labour's problem in those red wall seats. It's yet to be seen. He might do it, and he might be absolutely awful, or he might never get there, but those are the reasons why he's why you quite rightly said he's being touted as one of those to watch if Keir Starmer was to step down. at any point in the future.
And of course, as a good segue here, another person who has occasionally been touted as a potential Labour leader in the future is Sadiq Khan, who is the current London mayor, and he won again, which I don't think was a particular surprise. But I think this is one where the polling was a bit off, because the polling we saw suggested that he might win in a landslide and get all of the first, get more than 50% of the first preference votes and then just win easily, and actually ended up being a bit more of a close run thing. So that's one thing to note, and I'm sure you'll deal with that in a second. And the other thing I want to bring up just at the start is you mentioned about how there's normally only like 4 types of candidate, of which 3 are left-wing for a mayoral election, and then it kind of ends up in the left-wing person's favour. Not quite the same in London. So we have Labour, obviously Sadiq Khan. We had Sean Bailey for the Conservatives. There was Sian Berry, who's co-leader of the Green Party for the Greens, and Louisa Porritt for the Liberal Democrats. So they're your 4 main parties. But then we had a big list of other candidates. So I won't go into all of the independents, but we had the Renew Party, who I didn't really see much about. We had Count Binface, everyone's favourite satirical candidate, who crowdfunded his £10,000 deposit and released several hilarious songs on YouTube. I'm sure I can put some of those in the show notes. Enjoy those. We had the Burning Pink Party, which is a weirdly named party because it's a climate change activism party, and the candidate herself, I think, was arrested during the run-up to the election for being one of the people who, I think I'm right in saying there were several actions that happened from Extinction Rebellion, but I believe she was one of the people who was involved in some vandalism at HSBC that did the rounds. So I don't know if she was charged with anything off the top of my head, but I believe she was taken in for questioning over that at least. Piers Corbyn, brother of Jeremy Corbyn, who is a weather forecaster, his older brother, and I think I can say actually, no, it's probably technically libel in the UK to say what I think about Piers Corbyn, but he was running for the Let London Live party, who were all anti-maskers and things like that, which is interesting. There was the Reclaim Party with Lawrence Fox, the actor from Lewis, who has gone very much down the right-wing side of things and become a bit of a joke, I think, of himself. Then there was the UKIP's Peter Gammons, who was hilariously named, and I saw some of his stuff. Rejoin EU, someone who wanted to campaign to rejoin the Erasmus programme and get more support for performing arts, but I didn't see any of their stuff. Animal Welfare Party, didn't see any of their stuff. Social Democratic Party, who was an unsuccessful Brexit Party candidate. Okay. And then we have the Heritage Party, David Curtin, an ex-school teacher of mine. That was a bit surprising to find out. Yeah. Apparently he's been running for all sorts of interesting things since he was our school teacher. Then there's the Women's Equality Party, and then the London Real Party, which was a podcaster who actively promoted misinformation related to the COVID-19 pandemic. So that's fun. Didn't see any of his stuff either. But we definitely had Women's Equality Party stuff come through. I saw some Heritage Party stuff. I saw Let London Live stuff around, but didn't get delivered. And Count Binface was pretty much all over the place. So there's at least a bit more interesting candidates going on, but that, obviously they're not in the real running, those people.
So yeah, no, you've explained a myriad of colourful characters that were at the London election.
Who didn't have a real chance. Yes.
Yes, correct. So I think you're right. Your first point about the polling was absolutely right. Or may have even contributed to what we saw happening. So for months and months and months, everybody was like, well, Sadiq Khan's got this wrapped up, because the Conservative Party, Sean Bailey, seemed to be one that the Conservatives had built in a lab to try and get you the worst possible London mayoral candidate. You could. He was just, his policies were odd. A lot of people were looking at it saying, really, this is what you've got to offer us? And they were kind of relying on what I would call lazy remarks from the House of Commons. I know that Jacob Rees-Mogg is often slagging off Sadiq Khan as Red Khan, and this kind of, yes, we know London needs a Conservative mayor in London, vote for us, blah, blah, blah. So because Sadiq was meant to win by so much, I think there was a level of complacency amongst voters, perhaps, that led them to say, oh, maybe I'll give my first preference to the Greens, or maybe I will, go Lib Dem this time, or hey, why not? I'll vote Binface so he gets more votes than Lawrence Fox, which was one thing that was going around Twitter, at least giving your first preference to somebody else other than Sadiq, knowing that Sadiq's probably going to win anyway, and with the second preference thing, it means my first vote maybe doesn't matter as much, and I can send a message.
There was even a candidate who I didn't mention. One of the independents was a YouTuber purely seeking to win more votes than Lawrence Fox.
Yes. So, yeah, I think maybe that complacency played into the Conservatives' hands a little bit, or at least led me to, because the London votes came out a long time after those Hartlepool votes. I was looking at Twitter, and there's Guido Fawkes, which is one of the more like right-wing news sources on Twitter. They broke something basically saying Sean Bailey's looking at these votes coming in this part of London, and they're saying that there's a chance he might win, which sounded bizarre. If you told anybody that like a month ago, they would have said, what are you smoking? But the fact that it was coming out as maybe a semi-plausible story was worrying if you were on the Labour side, to think, oh my goodness, how we've just been humiliated up in Hartlepool. How bad can the rest of this sort of day be? As it was, I don't think it came to much. And even though you've said that there was a lot of parties on the right in London, a lot of those that you've mentioned, like from the Piers Corbyns to the Lawrence Foxes to UKIP, they all kind of ran on an anti-lockdown platform. That seemed to be the common theme that was amongst those parties, at least. And it was clear to me that has far less pull for the general public than the issue of Brexit did. You still might get those on the far right, or those who are particularly married to that idea of being anti-lockdown, to vote for them first choice, but they never got anywhere in the numbers that a UKIP candidate would have done anywhere else in the country. So I think that's, at least, it might be reassuring that if you, like you say, if you spend a lot of time on Twitter and in bubbles, you'd think there was this massive anti-lockdown movement growing across the country as COVID took over as the main story rather than Brexit. But it appears that when that went to the ballot box, that anti-lockdown message was firmly rejected by the majority of people when presented with two pro-lockdown parties, essentially in the Conservatives and Labour and the mainstream. So that might be one big thing we've learned. As we mentioned, Sadiq Khan came home fairly comfortably in the end. And it was sort of it was a reason that Labour didn't have to completely panic. Goodness, if Labour had lost the London mayor election, I think you would have seen real crisis talks happening, because we've mentioned for a long time how London is seen as the centre of like Labour, the metropolitan elites, as Boris Johnson would put it. But that seems to be where Labour has been able to gain a lot of support, particularly in the Corbyn years, and that's where they've seen their vote share rise. So if they were to lose that, it would have been a huge disaster. But yeah, they got away with it this time. It'll be interesting to see how Sadiq Khan will do next time, if he does stand next time, what a more capable Conservative candidate can do, because I don't know, you live there. It was my impression that Sadiq Khan is, some of the buzz maybe about Sadiq Khan that happened in 2016 wasn't quite there in 2021. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that he's been capable, and no one, like, I haven't spoken to anyone that, I mean, again, bubbles here, but like, I haven't really spoken to anyone who dislikes him, which I think is generally a good sign for a politician. I mean, you do hear things, some people have complained about various policies that were being brought in, but they're like policies he stood on, so it's not surprising, to do with TfL and things like that. And then apparently, he's not that great with civil servants, I've heard. But again, that's one of those things where I feel like any major politician probably gets that kind of impression from some civil servants. So, like, I mean, I'm sure he was better than Boris was when Boris was like ignoring everything his civil servants told him. I think it's a question of degrees. I'm sure you can always find someone who doesn't like, I mean, you can obviously find 44.8% of people who prefer someone over him. So I'm sure you can find at least one person who doesn't like him in that group. But yeah, in general, I think he's been seen as a safe pair of hands. And Sean Bailey, like you said, he was kind of running this limited kind of a campaign trying to find the floor for their votes. I basically heard nothing about him here. And I'm sitting in what I would call, like, I mean, if you look at the map of where they voted, our constituency voted more Conservative than Labour, but I didn't see any Sean Bailey propaganda at all. I almost didn't know he existed if it weren't for this podcast, which is kind of funny. Whereas last time around, at least, Zach Goldsmith was kind of in the news. Sean Bailey, I think, popped up once or twice.
Just going to go back to your point on Khan, where he's been a safe pair of hands. If we compare him to a mayor that we were talking about earlier, Andy Burnham, I think that's somebody who's taken the mayorship and has elevated their profile because of it. I don't think Sadiq Khan has done the same in London, and maybe that's why this was more of not the landslide they were expecting. It was more toned down. Do you get what I mean? Like, Burnham clearly is increasing his support up in Manchester and what he's doing up there. Sadiq Khan seems to be able to win elections capably, but maybe not be the in candidate of the moment, if you get what I mean, just if I'm looking at the general vibe.
One other thing I want to talk, if you look at 2016, there was a 7% increase in turnout, probably people coming out to ensure we got a Labour mayor after we'd had Boris Johnson for a period of time. And, there tends to be an increase in turnout when there's a shift in the electorate like that. They go, no, I won't stand for this kind of thing. Whereas this year there was a drop of 3% over that. So still not down to 2012 levels when Boris won his second term. There was a drop. But then if you look at the overall percentages, like Sadiq Khan didn't do as well in the first preference, but there were a lot more people to vote for first preference. As you said, I think there was that bit of a complacency kind of set in where people went, oh, well, he's just going to win. So that means I can put my first preference as I want, which is the whole benefit of a system like this, that you can actually vote for who you care for. And then in the end, the result that the majority of people would want ends up being the result. But his actual overall percentage, when everything was counted with the second preference, is only dropped by about 1% since, or 1.5% since 2016. So, he's still doing well. Sean Bailey basically gained the 1.6% that Sadiq Khan lost. Whereas it's in that first round that, so like Sean Berry got an extra 2% in the first round over last time and stuff like that. So I think, as you say, that this kind of effect, there's kind of almost a chilling effect from such good polls. But I also spoke to people, I've spoken to a few people who are like, oh, well, I'm not sure if I can be bothered to vote for the London mayoral election because I know which way it's going to go. And so that's probably that 3% of people that drop off. Whereas, when it becomes closer and it's more of a big deal, then, like, as you say, it's just kind of ticking along as it would. So, yeah. I suppose I haven't really added much to what you just said there, but yeah. So moving on, what about Scotland and Wales?
Yeah, so finally on these topics of elections, there were also elections for the Welsh Assembly and the Scottish Parliament, which kind of, again, is a big Conservative success story in England, but in Wales and Scotland, it was quite another matter. So if you look in Wales, Labour were able to quite comfortably keep their position in charge of the Welsh Assembly, winning 30 seats in total and gaining 1. The Conservatives did gain 5 and took their total up to 16, which is now above Plaid Cymru. But equally, we saw a loss of 7 seats for UKIP, which we'd expect. So maybe it looks like the Conservatives probably were hoping to have a bit more of a dent into the Labour leaders' control over Wales, particularly when the leader over there has taken a slightly different tack to the British government on coronavirus, putting in like lockdowns, much more stringent measures. There were some who were very upset that they kind of took away the sales of non-essential goods in supermarkets. So there was like Tesco's in Wales where they boarded off the books section. And the logic behind that was like, oh, so we can keep independent bookshops running, but independent bookshops are also closed, so people were just buying them off Amazon anyway. So there were some slightly confusing policies there, which maybe the Conservatives felt they could make more of a dent, but didn't. So that's a very quick overview of Wales. And then in Scotland, you had the SNP once again doing very well. It won 64 seats. It was just one short of an overall majority, but it is more than it won back in the last election in 2016. And as I keep having to stress when we talk about Scottish politics, the way that voting system is set up, it's actually designed to produce coalitions. So it's incredible that the SNP were able to run with full majority government up there anyway. Such was their success pre-2016. And the fact the Conservatives were, only able to really pick up, I'm trying to see how many seats they actually picked up in total if they won.
The Conservatives have increased their seats by 1, but right. The Conservatives are steady, and I think it's because they increased their seats by 1 in a by-election previously. That's my understanding. I can't be sure of that, but that's how it looks to me. So SNP gained 1 seat, Conservatives gained none, but they have more than before. So that implies there was some kind of by-election going on. Labour lost 2, Greens gained 2, and Lib Dems lost 1. I realise we're going over this quite quickly, but with the Welsh Assembly, not much of a surprise, I think, would probably be the answer. And similarly, I'm not sure the SNP gaining something here is too much of a surprise. But the interesting thing here is that the SNP are trying to ramp up to asking for a second referendum. And part of the argument there is if they had a majority, they'd be like, well, a majority of the public want a second referendum. By not quite getting that majority, they can say we're the party in charge. They can still, but that there's a bit less political cachet in that than, like, if you said we have a majority voting for SNP, then it's easy to make the argument that there's a majority for independence and therefore it's worth having the referendum. Obviously, I don't think Boris Johnson's going to give them the option of a referendum anyway, but I think there'd be a stronger argument from Nicola Sturgeon if she had that 1 extra seat.
Yes, totally. I agree with that. And you can see that their only successful attempt to ask for a referendum was before 2016 when, of course, they had the majority, so were able to kind of put that pressure on David Cameron to run one. Maybe just summing up, like, the entire results over the night and looking at it split into the different nations, it's a win basically for parties that were in charge during the coronavirus outbreak. So like the SNP obviously ran their side of things up there. Labour ran it in Wales, and the Conservatives were in charge in England and the rest of the country, obviously, but mostly England had nowhere else to turn for their COVID rules. It was just run by the Conservatives. The voters seem to have rewarded those parties in some way, shape or form, and none of them have taken a big hit. So maybe that's one thing to be sort of saying, even though we've been critical about a lot of government's handling of the coronavirus outbreak, maybe in these times of crisis or of upheaval, people do look to those who have been in charge to allow that stability and say, yes, we'll give you another chance. Given that it didn't go disastrously wrong, I think if things had gone, saying you couldn't get stuff on shelves or whatever, or the apocalyptic predictions that were like way, way back at the start, if things had really broken down, I don't think you would see this result. But as the governments had been seen to managing it for over a year, having these elections now did seem to reward those pro-lockdown parties that were in charge at the time.
Yeah, no, I think I agree with that, essentially. I don't have much else to add. So I appreciate we've spent slightly longer on that, but it was good to have that election analysis. So we have our second big story tonight, and the headlines we have for that are Domshell from the Metro, which is quite pleasingly terribly spelled, and Pure Revenge from the Express. What was going on there, Rob?
Yeah, so Dominic Cummings, the previous chief advisor to Boris Johnson, was going in front of a select committee, basically to talk about what happened in the government during the coronavirus outbreak and to give his opinion on what happened. This was always kind of marked out in Politico's calendars as one not to miss, particularly when you've essentially got a disgruntled former employee, as Dominic Cummings now is, given that he walked away from the government late in 2020, to give his opinion. And given that we've seen him before in the Rose Garden, we know he's a bit of a maverick, people felt that it might be more of a honest or raw assessment than you know about what happened in government at this time than you compared to what you might get from a sitting cabinet MP. And I would say Dominic didn't disappoint on that front. He certainly gave headline writers a lot of ammunition to throw at the government over the course of 6 to 8 hours. I think he was there being grilled.
Yeah, it was. I mean, like stuff was coming out throughout the whole day, and it's amazing how long it was. 7-hour joint session. That's for over that 7-hour joint session. I think there were, according to the BBC, at least 7 different main takeaways. So, do we want to run through those?
Yeah. Let's go through them one by one.
Number 1 on there is the government fail.
Yes, and this is kind of what Cummings led his whole sort of testimony out as, kind of him coming up and saying, look, we're really, really sorry. I feel that the government failed the public on several levels, and maybe the one that made the most headlines, or the ones that you can grab out of that, was the, quote, tens of thousands of people died who didn't need to die, which is a stunning admission, I'd say. And as Dominic Cummings, as whatever you think of the man himself, at least he was saying to the select committee that he felt a great deal of remorse that he wasn't able to, and the government wasn't able to do more to save those people. Now, we'll go into some of his more explosive claims about to why they failed, but to hear that from a senior government advisor, for them to say, yes, we take responsibility for it. Obviously, Boris Johnson has taken responsibility a number of times in the Commons when questioned about it, but he's never gone so far as to say that they failed the British public. The Conservative stance has always been that, look, we're doing our best here and we're just trying to get our way through this terrible situation. But yeah, I think those type of words could only come from Cummings himself. So that's why, quite rightly, they made headlines.
Well, one other bit in that segment I want to pull out is that he also said that the government wasn't ready, essentially, for the pandemic, not on a war footing in January and February, as he put it. And he said lots of key people were literally skiing, which I think there was a lot of that talk at the start, in March when we started to lock down of, there was a super spreader event from someone who'd been skiing. There was a lot of like life is normal while this was building up and spreading. And partly that's because we didn't have a good way of tracing it and people missed things. But I suppose it's an easy dig for him to put in at that point. So the next thing he said was the Prime Minister was not fit for office.
Yeah, so Cummings does lay some of the blame for why the government failed at Boris's feet, and uses that as an argument for saying why he wasn't fit for office. So one of the things he was talking about was very early on in that crisis. So Dominic Cummings looked back and said, look, we should have been on a war footing in January, February, rather than March. We had these reports coming in from China, and we knew what was starting to happen in Italy, etc., but we didn't really worry about it until it was far too late. And maybe one of the reasons behind that was that Boris Johnson was downplaying fears. It was even said that the reason that Boris Johnson didn't go to some Cobra meetings at the start was because he would be actively trying to play it down so Cobra wouldn't discuss it. And Dominic Cummings wanted Cobra to discuss it to make sure they had some sort of plan. Some of the weirder stories that came out, he described it as the new swine flu, which was famously a potential pandemic that didn't have the same mortality rate as coronavirus did and wasn't as serious. He felt that the whole thing was overblown, and even once joked that he would be injected live on TV with the virus by Chris Whitty, so everybody realises it's nothing to be frightened of, which sounds silly. But also when you think back to those clips of Boris Johnson in the early days of the pandemic where he said, I went to see all those coronavirus patients and I shook every one of their hands, kind of going against all the hand-washing advice that would come merely weeks later, it maybe does show that there is a problem at the heart of government. The other things that he was criticised about, he used a shopping trolley analogy, saying that he would wobble from side to side, basically, particularly when thinking about the second lockdown, Boris Johnson would go between, yes, I want a lockdown, and no, and wouldn't make a decision. And that inability to make a decision was what ultimately led to, delaying that lockdown was the one that maybe cost people tens of thousands of lives, not only at the start, but in preventing that second wave. That's where Dominic Cummings felt that the PM was unfit.
One claim was he's 1,000 times too obsessed with the media, appearing to be persuaded by the Daily Telegraph's view of events on any given day, which is kind of reminiscent of how people said Trump was basically doing all of his decisions based off what Fox News said. Mm-hmm. The other thing in this section here is talks about how Dominic Cummings thought he was unfit for the job and was trying to create a structure around the Prime Minister. This is where Dominic Cummings is showing through. Dominic Cummings thinks he knows better than everyone, and that's not necessarily true. And presumably, I'm not saying that I agree with Boris Johnson in this situation, but I do think that most people would agree that the special advisors should not be able to stop the Prime Minister doing their decisions. Their job is to advise. And here he's talking about how he's trying to funnel him and everything, and that sounds very much like overreach from the position of a special advisor.
No, that's very fair. I think the other point, it isn't mentioned in this stream from the BBC, but the other one that stood out with me when he was talking about about Boris Johnson being unfit to lead, he talked about there being something very fundamentally wrong with our politics, where the choice back in 2019 was one between Jeremy Corbyn and Boris Johnson, and it was clear that Dominic Cummings felt both of them were unfit for office, which is kind of surprising if he felt that back in 2019, but still was pledged to be a special advisor to the man he would later serve as Prime Minister. That was quite eye-opening. Not that Dominic Cummings was putting himself forward as a leader. Dominic Cummings kind of was talking up the experts and people who knew far more than himself in this regard, and kind of seemed to be suggesting that there were those more able who have that expertise who should be leader. But it was clear after this testimony that Dominic Cummings' personal view of Boris Johnson is certainly very low indeed.
So the third point, Hancock should have been fired. And in fact, the full quote is, Mr. Hancock should have been fired for at least 15 to 20 things, which I don't think would surprise any of us who've been following Matt Hancock's career.
Yeah, talking about other people that Dominic Cummings seems to have little respect for, Matt Hancock was mentioned several times and seemed to be held in very low regard by Mr. Cummings. The reasons for his firing, the reasons why, if Dominic had been in charge, he would have fired Matt Hancock, were maybe some of the more damaging allegations that came out of this whole testimony. So he kind of said that Hancock was the one that made the pledge of 100,000 tests a day in April, and then that was something that the media obsessed over, and he kind of put the blame at Hancock's feet for making that a thing when it really shouldn't have been. There should have been the aim to increase testing rather than having this weird number that I think we discussed at the time that the numbers were even kind of fudged to get them to reach that target in the end. The other thing, I think one of the more damaging, was that he basically said in front of the cabinet that people were being tested before they were discharged from hospital into care homes, which is vital because you want to make sure that if you're being discharged from hospital, you don't bring the coronavirus into care homes where people are incredibly vulnerable. Dominic Cummings believes that later that was untrue and that Hancock had misled the cabinet by promising that was happening, and it actually wasn't. And again, this was another scenario where the government failed and people lost their lives where they needn't had if that testing had gone ahead as promised. So yeah, I think that was that was very damning for Matt Hancock. And even on the day of the news coming out, there's a weird interview outside his house. I don't know if you saw it, where basically someone said, "Have you been watching the testimony, Mr. Hancock?" He said, "No, I'm sorry, I haven't. I'm too busy saving lives." And then sort of jogged off.
Oh, that's one of those things that is beyond satire, right?
Yeah.
That seems like something you'd have in the thick of it, and then you'd have a whole episode about how they have to deal with the fallout from that comment.
Ironically, maybe Cummings having a go at Hancock like this has strengthened Hancock's position in the short term, just because I don't think Boris Johnson would like Cummings to have a win out of this situation, so he's more likely to stand strongly by Hancock, at least in the short term. But I do wonder if in any sort of public inquiry that goes on to coronavirus in the future, Matt Hancock is clearly going to be one of the key witnesses in all of that. And if he is proved that he's misled the cabinet on occasions, that's a very serious allegation. And it was made clear to Dominic Cummings that it was a very serious allegation he was making. And Cummings seems to be like, yeah, sure, no, that's fine. I'll definitely go on record with that. I've got no problem. So if he does, then that does spell more problems for Hancock down the line.
The next thing, number 4 on this list, was talking about the lockdown delay. I think we've kind of talked about that already. You said about the Prime Minister kind of going back and forth over the lockdown. So I don't think we need to add any more there.
The one thing I would like to add is, and this is another thing where you've got Cummings and his analogies that came in. Like he talked about the Spider-Man meme, for example, which I never thought I'd hear anybody in senior government talk about memes in very senior hearings. He kept on bringing on Independence Day as well when he was talking about this. Essentially, he was saying that some of the modelling they had at the start was quite wrong, where they imagined that they were going to get the peak in June, so they thought they had lots of time to prepare, when actually, come early March, the peak was already upon them, and they had to act now. They were caught very cold on this whole situation, and all the modellers and forecasters kind of got that bit wrong. So maybe that was why the government was a little bit flat-footed. But that's why he does put some of the blame on Boris Johnson, but also kind of spreads that blame amongst, there was this groupthink, as he called it, a groupthink amongst the higher-ups that, you don't have to worry about this quite yet. We've got plenty of time to prepare, when clearly that wasn't the case.
And then next up, there's a section talking about this one particular day in March where the government was still considering the lockdown, but was seemingly spending too much time dealing with the possibility of bombing Iraq again.
Yes.
And the Prime Minister's girlfriend, now married, and that's a totally different story that we don't have time to go into, Carrie Symonds being overly involved due to a story in the Times with the headline "Downing Street dog to be reshuffled."
Yeah, so this is bizarre slightly, but it's not a surprise that Cummings mentioned Carrie Symonds. He's the one who allegedly came up with the nickname Princess Nut Nuts and labelled her as maybe a potential leaker within the government, because they had lots of problems with leaks coming out from top meetings. But in general, the picture that Cummings paints is one of chaos and not complete focus on the coronavirus outbreak, as he believes there should have been. So like you said, he was distracted by things going on from pressure from the US president, who was Trump at the time, saying they might bomb Iraq, and this bizarre story about Carrie Symonds' dog. I think the point Cummings is trying to make there is that when you weigh that up against the seriousness of a pandemic, it's clear what the government should be spending time on. The fact that this was taken seriously and took time away from those discussions, I think shows that Carrie maybe was, at least in Dominic's eyes, a bit of a distraction for the PM. And I think certainly what this paints in general is you have, in politics, we like to have like schools of thought about how governments work and relate them to TV shows. This certainly isn't the West Wing model. This is definitely more the thick of it model, where nobody actually knows what they're doing and there's chaos at the top. And it's worrying that you've got that kind of system in charge, particularly when you have something as serious as coronavirus going on that needs a very organised pair of hands. If there was that chaos, then maybe, again, that's why the government failed in that respect, to get the virus under control far quicker.
So smashing on through these points. Number 6, chicken pox parties.
Yes, we had this idea of herd immunity bounced around, and even that phrase was put to Cummings. It was even attributed to Cummings early on that was the government's strategy, and that was widely denied by the government at a later stage by saying, no, herd immunity was never the plan of the government. It appeared that fact was entirely wrong, and that herd immunity was going to be the plan of the government to try and get a certain herd immunity by September. And part of that was kind of chickenpox parties. You've got coronavirus, but you're not suffering particularly from it, or you want to get it amongst young people. Let's spread it amongst young people so we can get herd immunity amongst the general populace. That's how we get this virus. That's how we control this virus in the long term. Listening to what he said in the testimony, I think Cummings has a slight point, or there is a defense of the government here, that the experts were kind of saying that herd immunity was inevitable. The only way to control the virus is through herd immunity because vaccines will be years and years and years away. So actually, we need to control it through this strategy instead. And it may have been at a time where their assumptions about how infectious the coronavirus was and how deadly it was were also misjudged. Because if you've got a flu that kills 0.001% of the population, maybe herd and is not as infectious as coronavirus, maybe herd immunity is more of a viable strategy. And Dominic Cummings kind of said that herd immunity was never, it was always considered in all of their conversations. That was always the end point. There was never even something, the vaccine was never even considered as a possibility. So that's why they were talking about it. Clearly, we're in a very different world now. And with the benefit of hindsight, you can kind of see that as madness and quite concerning to think something that we, if anybody in a household gets it, we now quarantine that entire household and they have to isolate for 14, 21 days, whatever it is. That's the exact opposite of those chickenpox parties that they were suggesting. So to know that that was the strategy of the government at the time is, kind of worrying, I would say.
There was a point where people seemed to think herd immunity might work. And I mean, it was definitely a thing that was discussed in the lead up to lockdown. But once we were in lockdown, it was very much, I think people were very much aware it shouldn't be a thing. But there was a point where people said, is herd immunity? And I was, some people asked me, I am not that kind of doctor and I'm not a biologist, but some people are like, is herd immunity? And I was like, well, herd immunity is a thing for other diseases. Could work. We don't know anything about it. I hope I couched that to people when I was talking about it. But then I think most of us were not particularly worried about it when we first heard about it, right? It was one of those things where most people went, it's a bit like when we heard about SARS. And I mean, it was similar, except it got out and it got everywhere. Whereas with SARS, people were able to keep it locked down to very specific areas and then it kind of died off. I think people who grew up with hearing about SARS and it being overblown were maybe underprepared for COVID-19. I think that's probably fair to say. I mean, that's at least my personal feeling on it. That's how I felt at the time. I was like, I remember people talking about this when I was a kid and it wasn't a big deal. And I kind of didn't really think about it until it had hit us. And with the benefit of hindsight, that's how you miss things, right?
Yeah, totally.
So number 7, our final point in here, the PM ignored second lockdown advice. So we've already kind of touched on this, but I don't know if you want to add anything in particular here.
Yeah, I think the fact that the Prime Minister was saying now that he believed the economic harm was worse than what COVID would cause in number of deaths, etc. And the fact he was going in the face of all expert advice around him is sort of worrying that he took that tack. And that's where you've got those, let the bodies pile high comments, which we've talked about in the past. You can easily see where those comments might have come when he was discussing these type of matters. It also shows to me the fact that he was both ignoring experts' advice and the fact that Cummings says that the cabinet wasn't involved or asked in those decisions shows me that we are away from the cabinet form of government that we've had in the past. So tends to be under prime ministers that have far more, a far less majority in parliament. They need the support of strong cabinet ministers around them to make sure they can garner support from all corners of the party. It seems very clear that in this case that Boris Johnson is the leader and what he says goes, and those cabinet is very much just, I've talked about in the past how I feel they're quite a weak cabinet and just yes people who agree with the prime minister and wanted to enact his Brexit vision. That kind of causes a problem in a pandemic scenario when you might want those stronger voices coming out either to go against the Prime Minister or say, no, you should listen to this expert advice. And in fact, this was where Dominic Cummings is a little, it gives MattHancock some praise by saying that Hancock agreed that the lockdown was a good idea in September, and that's where he differed from the Prime Minister. It's not mentioned here in this BBC article as well, but Cummings does talk about the time where Boris Johnson was ill, and at that time there was very much a power vacuum in government. He describes it as chaos there where nobody really knew who to look for, and even mentioned in his testimony that Boris Johnson might even be a fan of chaos because in chaos, if people don't know where to look, they know to look to Boris Johnson as the leader. That's the one place they can look because they don't know where else to. So if that's the type of government that's leading us through this pandemic, and we said it again, that if he's flip-flopping between those lockdown choices and if he was late coming to that lockdown decision because he was so against it for weeks and weeks and weeks, and that led to us having a higher second wave peak. That's again where you feed it back to that first comment of the government has failed and tens of thousands of people died where they didn't need to. And it's these sort of discussions, Dominic Cummings' testimony, even if it hasn't quite had a long-lasting effect in the news cycle that's happened in the week following it, these comments will be brought up again and again, particularly when we have an inquiry into what happened in the coronavirus outbreak. And I don't think it looked particularly good for the government if what Cummings has said in this testimony, if that's proved to be true.
And I think kind of echoing that, I'm not sure there were particular quotes that stood out that we've picked on, but a lot of this is what people suspected. Maybe some of the details are a bit different. Like there was the picture of the whiteboard with stuff written on it and things like that came out. But I think it's more that, this is partly confirmation. And, Dominic Cummings is a biased person trying to spin the events in a certain way. I mean, he's saying that he was at fault partly, but he's definitely trying to shovel more fault onto other people. How accurate that is, we don't know. But I think it's confirming a lot of what people suspected. And so, I think that's essentially what it's done. It's like, saying the quiet things out loud a bit. We obviously don't have any polls this week, as we just discussed a whole raft of local elections. I think it's a while until we have any local polls, but there are a few international polls we might start looking at in future weeks. I know we've already talked about Germany a bit. Their main election is still a little way away. But there's a few other polls we might focus on. Again, if you find any interesting polls that aren't necessarily political, we're happy to talk about that as a bit of levity at the end of the programme as well. Speaking of, if you want to get in contact with us, you can find us at parliamentary.observer. You can find us on Twitter and Instagram at unparlpodcast. You can find us on Facebook as Unparliamentary Language, and you can find us on Reddit at /r/unparliamentary. And you can also, if you wish to support the show, throw a few dollars our way and get some bonus Patreon content that we put out with every episode. You can go to patreon.com/TTSS. I don't think there's anything else left for me to say other than it's good night from me.
And it's good night from him. Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye-bye.
Bye. Join Mike and Tom for nerdy conversation with a multitude of guests on Hat of Many Things.
Say hi, guys.
Hi, guys.
Hello.
I'm Mark, a librarian and professional wrestling ring announcer.
I cast League of Legends.
Soteros Filbricato, best known for my work with White Wolf and Onyx Path Publishing on the World of Darkness.
Hi, I'm Jason Carl. I'm the producer of V5 at White Wolf.
Yeah, my name is Johanna Pettersson. I'm a Finnish game designer.